The heat of the Monterey sun shimmered across the asphalt when the deep growl of a '69 Mustang fastback suddenly died, leaving Ricardo Salazar stranded in the middle of an empty road. A man who built towers of glass and steel across the city now stood powerless before an old machine he once drove with pride. No chauffeur, no signal, no way out. Just silence, and the sting of his own arrogance. But fate had other plans. A faded wooden sign, almost erased by dust and time, appeared at the edge of the road, El Buen Pulso, and from its shadow stepped an old mechanic, his eyes sharp as steel, his hands steady as stone. What began as a broken car would soon become a test of pride, memory, and destiny, one that would change Ricardo's life forever. The Mustang's hood clicked hot as Richard Salazar stepped out and squinted through the heat ripples. The sun pressed on his shirt like a hand. He loosened his watchband, reflex habit control, and looked again at the phone in his palm. No bars, not even a ghost of a signal. He listened. No traffic, just a stray dog barking somewhere behind a wall and cicadas soaring the afternoon in half. "Brilliant," he muttered. "One day off the grid, and the grid takes it personally." He popped the hood. Steam didn't billow. The scare had passed. But there was a smell, sweet and metallic, and a thin watermark streaking the radiator neck. A man who spent his life approving budgets and buying buildings wasn't supposed to know these things, yet the muscle memory tugged at him. A 16-year-old with busted knuckles, coaxing life out of a borrowed carburetor. That kid had lived inside him once. He hadn't heard from him in years. A few yards ahead, the sun caught a sliver of tin nailed to a fence. He shaded his eyes. The sign had been wiped by sand and time until only a heartbeat of letters remained. El Buen Pulso. Good pulse. A name that sounded like stubborn pride. Richard followed the dirt shoulder until a low cinder-block shop came into view, squat and square, half the roof patched with corrugated sheets. A strand of faded prayer flags twitched along the eaves. The wide garage door was rolled up, and the interior breathed a coolness that smelled of oil, dust, and something older, like cedar left in shade. Out of that shade stepped an old man with a clean grey mustache and hands as steady as hinges. He didn't hurry. He didn't even glance at the watch Richard kept checking. He just took in the Mustang, the road, the tension in a stranger's shoulders. "You found the hottest part of the day," the man said, voice dry, amused. "Name's Julian Morales. Folks around here say Don Julian, but Julian is fine." "Richard," he said. "Radiator, maybe." She coughed, then died. No signal. Julian's eyes warmed at she. "A car's not a toaster. It remembers who speaks to it." He tapped the body near the fender, gentle, knuckles soft as if greeting an animal. "Let's roll her in." Richard worked the wheel while Julian guided. The Mustang, heavy as regret, eased into the bay. The old man lifted the hood and paused, not in confusion, but in the patience of someone listening. He took a rag, twisted the cap with careful fingers, and peered inside like reading a familiar book. "You've babied her," Julian said. "Except when you didn't." Richard almost laughed. "What gave me away?" Old hoses with new clamps, fresh paint on the cover, tired wires at the coil, like a man in an expensive suit wearing the same shoes from college. Richard rubbed the back of his neck. The sun had burned a line at the collar. "Can you get me back on the road today?" "Maybe," Julian said. "Depends what the car wants." He slid a tray close, arranged tools with the logic of a surgeon. "Coolant's low, cap stubborn. There's a stutter in your fuel delivery I don't like." He leaned, listening again. "But it's not a fight, it's a conversation." The words landed soft. Richard felt the itch to check the time. He didn't. A voice drifted from the back of the shop, bright as a bell, edged with grit. "Grandad, the delivery guy says he'll come by after 5. He wants cash this time." A young woman stepped into the light with a ledger tucked under her arm. Her hair was pinned messily, as if she'd been winning a fight with a fan and chose to pin the wind instead. She wore a simple linen dress and an expression that said, "We keep track of things here." "This is my granddaughter, Lucy," Julian said. "She runs the place when I forget what day it is." Lucy offered a hand, not shy, not polite for show, straightforward. "Hi, you look like you're melting. There's water in the fridge." "Thanks," Richard said, surprised by his own voice softening. "I'm Richard." "Nice car," she said, leaning near the fender with respect, not awe. "We get lots of ranch trucks and city runabouts, not many fastbacks." "It's a long story," he said. "Most good things are." She nodded toward a fan spinning in the corner. "Sit. Grandad works better when people aren't hovering." Julian shot her a look that was half scold, half grin. He can hover if he wants. The car hasn't had company like this in a while. Then to Richard, "If we need parts, the shop closes at 6. If it runs late, Lucy has rooms at the inn. Clean sheets, honest prices." "She's better at business than I ever was." Lucy rolled her eyes affectionately. "He forgets he taught me how to count." Richard took the bottle of water Lucy offered. The cold bit his palm, real as relief. He realized he was sweating not only from heat, but from the way the day unstitched his schedule. No assistant to juggle the calendar, no driver to buffer the world. Just the sound of a fan pushing warm air, and an old man who ignored the tyranny of minutes. "You can leave it with us," Julian said, peering deeper into the bay. "I'll pressure test the system, check the fuel lines, change what needs changing. It'll take care, not tricks. She'll run better than she did this morning." "How long?" The old reflex again. Julian shrugged. "As long as it takes to do right. I still do right here." The words should have annoyed Richard. Instead, they settled some quiet part of him he didn't admit existed. He glanced around the walls, hand-lettered charts for torque specs, Polaroids of cars with notes scribbled under them, a calendar 2 months behind. A wooden crucifix hung near the clock, like a promise to forgive time for passing. "Okay," Richard said. "Do it." "Good," Julian said, already easing clamps free. "Lucy will show you the inn." They crossed the street, a ribbon of heat over cracked asphalt. The inn sat next to a jacaranda tree dropping purple confetti. Inside, the lobby welcomed them with tile that remembered cooler months and a bowl of limes that made the air smell green. Lucy slid a guest book across the counter. "One night to start?" she asked, pen poised. He hesitated. "Let's say 2. "Slow traveler," she teased. "That's rare in a suit." Richard glanced down at his shirt. The cloth had creased in unfamiliar ways. "I gave my driver the day off to remember what it's like to drive. It was supposed to be simple." "It usually is," she said, "until it isn't." She handed him a key on a brass tag. "Room 3. If you need anything, extra towels, recommendations, ask. We keep a pot of coffee going after 6. "I thought coffee was a morning thing," Lucy smiled. "Here it's a wee, survived the afternoon thing." He climbed the stairs and found room 3, painted in a colour that could only be called patience. Soft, unbothered. The window framed the shop across the way. He could just make out Julian's silhouette, head bent, hands moving with the certainty of a prayer well practiced. Richard turned the key on the nightstand and sat on the bed. Springs sighed. He took off his watch and set it face down. The room hummed with distant radio, old songs with the bass turned low. He lay back and stared at the fan turning shadows on the ceiling. At some point, sleep skimmed him, shallow, restless. When he woke, the light had shifted. A boy's laugh rose from the street. He moved to the window. A young man stood by the shop door, with a backpack slung one shoulder, grease already on his knuckles like he wore it on purpose. He was talking fast, waving a small metal bracket as if it was something much bigger. Julian listened with that same grounded patience. The boy set the bracket on the counter, and even across the street Richard could see it wasn't standard. Angles different, weight different, a piece imagined, not ordered. The boy noticed Richard at the window and lifted a hand in an easy hello. His grin reached both sides of the street. Richard lifted his hand back before he had time to think why. A knock sounded at his door. He opened it to Lucy, holding a short stack of envelopes and a clipboard. "Sorry to bother," she said. "Mail for Grandad came to the inbox by accident." She tilted her head. "You okay?" "Yeah, just your grandfather's student?" "Matt," she said. "My cousin. He studies automotive engineering in the city. Comes back on weekends and whenever he can fake a holiday. Always building something. Sometimes it even works. And when it doesn't, he learns," she said simply. "That's the point." Richard looked down at her clipboard, handwritten notes, lists that made sense to the person who wrote them. It felt like peeking into a different species of order. "You run both places?" he asked. "Run is a generous word," she said, smiling. "Keep them honest is more like it." From the window, the Mustang caught a stripe of lowering sun, paint glowing like a live coal. Richard felt something uncoil just a little, something he'd wound tight without noticing. He thought of the towers he owned with their cold lobbies and polished silence, the calendar reminders he killed and rescheduled like gnats. A day off the leash had dragged him somewhere quiet, where machines had voices and people took the time to hear them. "Coffee after 6, right?" he said. "After 6, she confirmed. "And if you're hungry, I'm making caldo. Nothing fancy." "Fancy is overrated." She studied him a second, as if measuring the distance between the man in front of her and the one who had stepped into the shop an hour ago. "Sometimes," she agreed. "Sometimes not." When she left, Richard stayed at the window. Across the street, Julian and Matt stood over the Mustang, two silhouettes bent to the same problem, two generations fluent in the same old language. The boy pointed, the old man nodded. The fan under the shop eaves kept turning, faithful, unhurried. Richard didn't know it yet, but something had started to move inside him, something that had been idle longer than any engine. It wasn't dramatic. It was a small click, like a gear finding a tooth, enough to catch, enough to hold. He flipped his watch upright and didn't check the time. "Let it take as long as it takes to do right," he said to the empty room, and surprised himself by meaning it. The night in Monterey arrived heavy, pressing the heat into the walls until even the plaster seemed to sweat. Richard lay awake in room 3, listening to the ceiling fan creak. Downstairs, faint voices carried through the open courtyard, Lucy laughing with a guest, Julian humming some tune, while tools clinked like wind chimes of steel. Sleep came in fragments. Every time Richard closed his eyes, the Mustang reappeared in memory. Its hood open, the old man bent forward, the smell of hot coolant and worn hoses. He dreamed of youth, too. A beat-up Chevy truck that had coughed its way through his teenage summers, the way he used to crawl beneath it with grease under his nails, believing engines were puzzles he could always solve. Then money arrived. Business swept him into glass towers and air-conditioned silence. He had traded oil stains for polished shoes. Morning cracked the sky pale and grey. Roosters crowed outside the inn walls. By the time Richard pulled on yesterday's shirt, the courtyard smelled of strong coffee. Lucy was already there, hair tied up, moving fast between tables. "Morning, city man," she greeted, sliding a mug toward him. "Black, right? You don't look like you asked for cream." He smiled despite himself. "That obvious?" "Obvious is my job," she said, scribbling something on a notepad. "Grandad's at the shop. Matt's there too." They were already arguing about intake valves before sunrise. "Arguing?" She poured herself coffee and leaned on the counter. "That's how they bond. Grandad thinks patience fixes everything. Matt thinks innovation fixes everything. Put them in a room with one engine and sparks fly, sometimes literally." Richard carried his cup outside. Across the narrow street, the shop's wide door was open. Inside, Matt's voice rose quick and excited, countered by Julian's calm bass. He walked over, drawn more by curiosity than concern. Matt noticed him first. The young man had curly dark hair, grease smudges on both hands, and a face still lit with the optimism of 22. "Morning? You must be the Mustang guy. Man, she's a beauty. Grandpa says you're keeping her stock, but I've got ideas if you're open." Julian cut him a look. "Ideas don't always get a man home safe." Richard chuckled. "Let's hear them anyway." Matt's grin widened. He held up a small sketchbook, pages filled with scribbled diagrams. "See this? A hybrid conversion kit. Low cost, adaptable to classics like yours. It won't ruin the sound or the feel, just gives it better efficiency and torque. Imagine a '69 Mustang that roars, but also sips fuel when it wants." Julian wiped his hands on a rag. "And imagine it failing halfway to the ranch because some wire wasn't soldered right. That's why we test, Grandpa." Richard studied the sketch. The lines weren't professional blueprints, but they pulsed with energy. The boy's fingers tapped the page like they couldn't keep still. Richard felt the echo of that old hunger, ambition before money made him cautious. "You studying engineering?" Richard asked. "Second year," Matt said proudly. "University in the city. I spend weekends here so Grandpa doesn't think I've gone soft." Julian muttered. "Engines don't care about degrees. They care about hands steady enough not to strip a bolt." Matt winked at Richard. "See? Same fight every morning." Richard laughed, shaking his head. "You two sound like my board meetings." Lucy appeared with a tray balanced on her hip, carrying breakfast. Warm tortillas, scrambled eggs, beans. She set it on a workbench without ceremony. "Eat before you start pulling each other's hair out." "Thank you, sweetheart," Julian said. Richard hesitated. "Are you sure? I can eat at the inn." "Sit," Lucy ordered. "You're family now. Stranded family, but family." They ate together. The eggs were fluffy, the beans smoky. Richard hadn't tasted food like this in years. Simple, no garnish, but grounding. Conversation flickered between them. Matt describing campus life, Lucy teasing him for exaggerating, Julian telling quiet stories of cars that came through the shop decades ago. At one point, Julian turned to Richard. "You built things too, right? Just not with wrenches." Richard nodded. "Buildings, developments, office towers." Julian's gaze lingered. "Steel and glass. Not so different. Still about foundation, patience, balance." Matt smirked. "Except his towers don't stall on the highway." Lucy kicked him under the table. "Respect." Richard laughed again, a sound that felt foreign in his own chest. He realized then how quickly this dusty shop and these strangers had begun to loosen something inside him. After breakfast, Julian slid back under the Mustang, tools clinking. Richard found himself hovering nearby, not out of impatience, but interest. He asked questions about the radiator pressure, about the fuel line. Julian answered patiently, explaining each step as though teaching a class of one. By midday, sweat darkened Julian's collar. Matt fetched parts from a shelf, debating every choice. Lucy swept the floor, humming. The shop felt alive, not mechanical, but human. And Richard felt time stretch, not wasted, not pressing, just existing. When the sun angled west, Julian emerged, wiping his brow. "She'll run," he said. "But she needs more than a patch. These hoses, the pump, if you rush her, she'll punish you again." Richard nodded slowly. "Do it right then." Julian's eyes softened. "Not many men with suits say that." "Maybe I'm tired of suits," Richard said quietly. Lucy glanced at him, curiosity flickering across her face. She didn't ask more. That evening, as the town cooled and cicadas gave way to crickets, Richard sat outside the inn with a plate of caldo. Lucy insisted he try. Across the street, the Mustang gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Hood closed now, but carrying the day's conversations within it. Matt passed by, still buzzing with ideas, sketchbook under his arm. "Tomorrow I'll show you the hybrid prototype," he called. "Just wait till you see." Julian followed behind, shaking his head, but smiling all the same. Richard leaned back in his chair, soup warming his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't think about schedules or deadlines. He thought about engines, about family, about how easily a man could forget what truly kept him running, and he had no idea yet, none, that this small detour on a blistering road was about to shift everything he thought he knew about himself. The next morning arrived with a strange calm. The air was cooler, a thin veil of clouds softening the sun. Richard crossed the street with a cup of Lucy's coffee in hand, almost eager, something he hadn't felt about mornings in years. Inside the shop, Julian was already bent over the Mustang, sleeves rolled, movements steady as prayer. Matt was there too, his sketchbook sprawled open across the workbench, pages weighted down with sockets and bolts. He looked up when Richard stepped in. "Morning! You ready to see the future?" Matt's grin was wide enough to disarm anyone. Julian grunted. "Future or nonsense, depending who you ask." Matt ignored him, pulling out a small rectangular device with wires sprouting like roots. "Prototype controller. I built it from scrap and borrowed chips. The idea's simple. You slip it between the fuel system and a hybrid module. You don't lose the Mustang's growl. You just gain options. Efficiency, torque, cleaner burn." Richard raised a brow. "And you've tested it?" "On simulations, yeah. On an actual car." "Not yet." Julian's head snapped up. "Not yet because it's not ready. Don't feed our guest your daydreams." Matt's eyes sparked. "Every invention is a daydream until someone's stubborn enough to build it." The air thickened with the weight of their difference. Richard felt caught between them. An old man defending tradition, a young man pushing against it. He sipped his coffee, listening. "Show me," Richard said finally. Matt blinked. "Seriously?" "Seriously." Julian threw the rag on the bench. "This isn't a toy. A man's life can ride on an engine's honesty. And a man's future," Matt shot back, "depends on taking chances." For a moment, Richard saw himself in both of them, the restless boy he once was in Matt, the cautious, weary businessman he had become in Julian's warning. He set the coffee down, his voice quiet. "Sometimes both are true." Julian studied him, eyes narrowing but said nothing. Matt seized the silence and plugged the device into a smaller mock-up engine he kept in the corner, a battered block mounted on a frame. He turned the key, and the machine sputtered, coughed, then steadied with a strange new hum, quieter but still throaty. "Listen," Matt urged. "Same heartbeat, just cleaner. You feel that?" Richard did. The vibration was smoother, more controlled. It didn't scream youth. It carried promise. Julian crossed his arms. "Engines sing because they're free. Chain them to gadgets and you lose their soul." "No, Grandpa," Matt said softly. "You help them survive." The room went still. Dust hung in the sunlight like tiny stars. Richard found himself stepping closer to the mock-up, placing a hand over the frame. The hum traveled into his palm. He remembered the first building he ever pitched to investors, the thrill of creating something no one else believed in. Somewhere along the years, that thrill had calcified into contracts and safe bets. He turned to Julian. "He's got something. You know it." Julian's jaw tightened. For the first time, his hands trembled. Barely, but enough. He looked at Richard, then at his grandson. His voice came low. "Ideas are heavy, boy. They can break you if you don't carry them right." "I'll carry it," Matt said firmly. Lucy entered just then, wiping flour from her hands, a tray of bread balanced against her hip. She caught the silence, the charged air. What happened? Julian shook his head. "Your cousin wants to gamble with engines." "It's not gambling," Matt argued. "It's building." Richard watched Lucy's face as she set the bread down. Her eyes moved between them, measuring. She didn't dismiss Matt, nor side with Julian. Instead, she looked at Richard. "And you? What do you think?" The question landed heavier than he expected. All eyes turned to him. Richard inhaled slowly. I think I forgot what it's like to believe in something risky. When I was Matt's age, I took chances that made no sense. I built towers out of sketches. Everyone told me they'd fall. But they stand today. He paused, glancing at Julian. I also learned that rushing costs more than waiting. Maybe what Matt needs isn't just freedom. Maybe he needs your patience too. The old man's eyes softened, but he didn't smile. He turned away, fiddling with a wrench to hide the weight of his thoughts. Lucy broke the tension by tearing a loaf of bread and handing it around. Eat first, argue later. Arguments on an empty stomach are just noise. They laughed a little, enough to ease the room. Yet under the surface, Richard felt it. Something had shifted. Matt's invention wasn't just a hobby. Julian's resistance wasn't just stubbornness. And his own role, accidental as it was, had become part of their balance. That night, as he walked back to the inn, Richard couldn't shake the feeling. The boy's eyes, bright with belief. The old man's voice, heavy with warning. And in between them, his own heart, split, unsettled, awake. The Mustang waited under the shop's roof, silent but alive, as if listening to the arguments around it. Richard thought of his watch again, the one he hadn't checked all day. He left it on the nightstand, face down, and for the first time in years, he didn't care what time it was. By the third morning, the town felt less like a stopover, and more like a room he'd forgotten in a house he used to love. Richard found Julian already at the bench, laying out gaskets like playing cards, each piece examined, accepted, or set aside. Matt hovered with a laptop and a bundle of tidy wires, nervous energy dressed as focus. Lucy swept the shop aisle, flour on her sleeve from early bread, hair pinned in that practical way that said she expected the day to misbehave. Radiators flushed, Julian said without looking up. Pumps new, hoses replaced. Your girl can breathe again. He tapped the Mustang's fender, a fond, private gesture. And the hybrid controller? Matt asked. Julian gave a single, judicial glance. We're not touching his car with your science project. It's not a science project, Matt said, working to keep his voice even. It's a bridge. Bridges fall if you cheat the math, Julian replied. Richard stepped in before the tension found its old groove. Let's get her running stock first, he said. Then we can talk about bridges. Matt bit back a retort and nodded. Okay, stock it is. They rolled the Mustang to the bay's edge. Sunlight sliced across the dash as Julian turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled into a steady, recognizable rumble. Not loud, not timid, a sound that made Richard's ribs remember. He smiled without permission. Julian listened with his whole body, chin tilted, eyes half closed, as if catching notes no one else could hear. Better, he murmured. But idle's not truth. Truth lives on the road. Test drive? Richard asked. Test drive, Julian confirmed. The four of them climbed in awkwardly. Julian behind the wheel, Richard passenger, Matt and Lucy squeezed in back, elbows and laughter and a spray of dust as they pulled onto the road. Wind pushed hot air through the cabin. The engine met the slope like an old friend, power even, temper held. Feels right, Richard said, surprised by the warmth in his voice. Feels honest, Julian corrected. They took the long loop past jacarandas and painted walls. Children chased a soccer ball across an alley, pausing to watch the car pass like a comet from a different decade. At a straightaway, Julian eased the throttle. The Mustang responded, not showy, not timid, confident, as if grateful to be believed in again. Back at the shop, Richard climbed out and rested his palms on the roof, slower to let go than he meant to be. How much do I owe you? He asked. Julian wiped his hands and named a number that embarrassed Richard with its fairness. That can't be right, Richard said. It's honest, Julian repeated. Honest keeps the lights on. Anything more is noise. Richard opened his mouth, then noticed the faint tremor in Julian's right hand, the same tremor he'd clocked on the day of the argument. It was small, but present. A man could ignore such things only so long. Lucy saw Richard notice. She stepped in with a soft, assertive cheerfulness. "Grandad, drink water," she said, handing him a bottle. "You get stubborn when the heat wins." "I'm always stubborn," he said, but he drank. Matt was already at the workbench, flipping open his sketchbook to a clean page. "So, about the bridge," he ventured, not meeting his grandfather's eyes. "There's a way to try it without touching the Mustang. The mock-up needs a real load test. We could mount it to my old Civic engine. If it holds, we know the controller's ready for stage 2. Julian leaned a hip against the bench. "If it fails, you burn wires, waste time, and bruise pride." "Pride heals," Matt said. "The planet won't. Not if we keep pretending classics have to guzzle forever." Richard felt the line thread through him, precise as a needle. He glanced at Lucy. She was watching both men with a look he recognized from boardrooms, someone calculating outcomes and costs at once. "What do you need?" Richard asked. Matt blinked. "For the Civic test? Better capacitors, a stabilized power module, cleaner soldering station." He shrugged. "And time." "How much?" Richard pressed. $200 would buy small miracles," Matt said, then flushed at how small the number sounded spoken aloud. Richard nodded slowly. "You'll have it." He reached for his wallet. Julian's hand came up, not sharp, not scolding, but firm. "Money never made a bad idea good," he said. "And fear never made a good idea real," Matt answered, gentler than before. Silence hovered. The fan clicked behind them like a metronome. Richard put the wallet away. "Then let's do this right. Not just cash dropped on a counter. A plan." He turned to Matt. "Write what you need, why you need it, and what failure looks like. Not to scare you, to make you ready. I'll fund that plan." Matt's eyes flickered with relief and respect, tempered now by the work the offer implied. "Okay," he said. "I can do that." Lucy exhaled. The room seemed to regain temperature. "Since we're planning, I need to run to the market," she said. "Grandad, please don't forget the delivery at 5. And—" She broke off, noticing a man in government khaki at the doorway, clipboard in hand, eyes already scanning the shop like a problem. "Senor Morales?" the man asked. "Inspection." Julian's shoulders squared a fraction. "We posted the fee last month." "It's not about the fee," the inspector said, stepping in. "New environmental compliance sheet, new fire extinguisher date, and your electrical panel. It's older than me." He gave a rehearsed sigh. "There are fines." Lucy met him halfway, polite but unyielding. "We run a safe shop. Show us the new list." The man flipped his clipboard, tapping lines with a capped pen. "You'll need upgrades. Wiring, extinguisher, disposal service contract. Total?" He did a quick sum, the kind that hurt even before it landed. 12,000 pesos to start. That was more than "honest keeps the lights on." That was a threat. Julian folded the paper once, then again, as if giving the news a smaller surface to land on. "We'll handle it," he said. After the inspector left, the silence was bare wood. Lucy unfolded the paper and scanned it, lips tight. "We can manage part," she said. "Not all. Not now." Richard felt the reflex rise, the easy fix, the round number, the parting handshake. He swallowed it. Money could make a mess cleaner. It could also erase the very thing that made the place matter. "Let me be clear," he said carefully. "I want to help, but not by writing a check like I'm buying guilt off the shelf." He looked at Julian. "You said honest keeps the lights on. Let's build honest in a way that lasts." Julian's face softened a shade. "Speak plain." "I have resources," Richard said. "Not just money. Lawyers who read these inspection lists in their sleep. Suppliers who owe me favors. Architects who know how to modernize without gutting soul." He tapped the paper. "We do this in steps. We get you compliant without losing what this place is." Lucy's posture shifted, less guarded, more curious. "Why?" she asked. Why would you do that for us? Richard looked at the Mustang, at the wall of Polaroids, at the fan that never stopped, even when no one noticed its work. Because I forgot what right feels like, he said. And you reminded me. The admission hung there, almost indecent in its vulnerability. No one mocked it. The shop seemed to accept it the way a machine accepts new oil, not with applause, but with quieter friction. Julian gave the smallest nod. We start with the panel, he said. I won't have a spark burn down a lifetime. Panel first, Richard echoed. Then extinguisher, disposal contract, the rest on a schedule that won't choke you. Matt snapped his sketchbook shut with a new resolve. I'll finish the plan tonight, he said. Controller phases, failure pathways, safety. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Lucy touched the inspection paper once more, as if taking its measure, then slid it into a folder marked Bills in a practiced hand. I'll make caldo, she said, half to herself. People think better when fed. They worked through the heat as if agreement were a cooling breeze. Richard called a contact. The line opened doors he hadn't walked through in years. Julian relabeled the breaker switches with a steadier hand than his tremor suggested. Matt soldered a test board, his strokes careful now, patience borrowed from the very man he was trying not to become too soon. Lucy moved between shop and kitchen, binding the day with the simple logic of meals and lists. Night fell almost without warning, the sky turning violet at the edges. They ate together in the doorway, where shop light met street dark. The Mustang sat quiet, tuned and content. Across the table, the inspection paper lay folded, not solved but named. When the plates were cleared, Julian rose, slower than he had that morning. He stood at the Mustang's nose and placed his palm on the hood. Tomorrow we test on the highway, he said. We see if honesty holds under pressure. Matt nodded, eyes bright. Tomorrow I'll bring the finished plan. Lucy looked at Richard. And you? I'll be here, he said simply. Some things you don't learn from a call. A breeze slipped through the lane, lifting the edge of Lucy's apron and the corner of Matt's sketches. The fan clicked on. Somewhere a radio played a song Richard didn't know, but felt like he must have loved once. He didn't check his watch. He didn't want to. He wanted tomorrow. Dawn came pale, the kind of light that slid quietly across the rooftops before the heat chased it away. Richard stood by the inn window, watching the street already alive. Lucy sweeping the storefront, Matt tightening straps on a backpack, Julian unlocking the shop door with the slowness of someone who had done it 10,000 mornings. Across the way, the Mustang gleamed like a patient animal ready to be tested. Its hood was shut now, its engine waiting. Richard felt a pull in his chest. Not just excitement, but something heavier. This wasn't just a car anymore. It had become a mirror. When he crossed the street, Julian handed him the keys without ceremony. She's ready. Take her. Richard blinked. You're not coming? I'll ride, Julian said, sliding into the passenger seat. His hands folded on his lap, not gripping, not guiding, just present. Lucy leaned on the doorway, apron dusted with flour. Don't break her, she teased. Matt slapped the trunk with youthful bravado. If you do, we'll make her better than before. The words stuck in Richard's mind as he slid behind the wheel. The leather was cracked, the wheel warm under his palms. He turned the key. The Mustang roared awake, deeper than yesterday, smoother. The vibration carried through the seat into his bones. He eased onto the road, dust rising behind them. Julian watched the horizon, saying nothing, but Richard felt the old man's attention sharp as a coiled spring. The road stretched open, 2 lanes threading through fields of scrub and jacaranda. Richard pressed the accelerator, the engine answering not with rebellion but with strength. The car surged forward, and for the first time in years he laughed, an unguarded, boyish sound. Feels alive, Richard said. Julian nodded once. Because you let her. They drove in silence for a while. The countryside passed like a slow film reel. Farmers bent over fields, a boy on a bicycle chasing the car until his legs gave out, clouds thickening like promises. Richard's laughter faded into thought. "You ever regret staying here?" Richard asked quietly. "Small shop, same town?" Julian's eyes stayed on the road. "A man only regrets when he tries to live someone else's life. This is mine. I fixed engines, raised family, kept my word, that's enough." Richard swallowed. "And if it wasn't?" "Then you make it enough," Julian said. His voice had the weight of gravel, steady, final. Back at the shop, Lucy and Matt were waiting, anxious as students awaiting grades. Richard parked, cutting the engine with reluctance. "She runs," Julian announced, stepping out. Matt grinned. "Told you she would." Richard climbed out slowly, still holding the keys. "She's more than running. She's right." He looked at Julian. "Thank you." Julian gave a small shrug, as if thanks were unnecessary. "Machines are honest. We just listen." The day unfolded in tasks. Lucy managed deliveries, scribbling notes with her efficient scrawl. Matt disappeared into the corner with wires and solder, his plan taking shape. Richard found himself drifting between them, lending a hand where he could, not as a boss, but as another pair of shoulders. At midday, they gathered for lunch, simple tortillas, beans, and the same smoky flavor that had grounded him before. Conversation swirled easily. Lucy teased Matt about burning toast at the inn. Matt defended himself with exaggerated pride. Julian listened, occasionally offering a dry comment that landed with perfect timing. Then the talk circled back to the inspector's list, heavy on the table, even without paper in sight. "We'll start with the panel tomorrow," Richard said. "My contact confirmed. Parts will arrive by evening." Lucy nodded. "That's one less shadow." Matt leaned forward, sketchbook open. "And I've mapped out phases for the controller. Safe testing, failure modes, fallback systems. If it passes the civic trial, we scale." He glanced at Richard nervously. "I don't just want your money, I want your eyes on it, your experience." Richard met his gaze. "Then you'll have both." Julian looked between them, face unreadable. Finally he said, "Dreams are loud, but if you're going to chase them with discipline. Promise me that." "I promise," Matt said, voice firm. The afternoon passed slower, the heat dragging time. Richard found himself alone in the shop for a moment, staring at the wall of Polaroids, cars and families, each photo a small story. He noticed younger versions of Julian, hands already dark with grease, children perched on hoods, Lucy as a child holding a wrench too big for her. One photo made him pause, Julian, younger, standing beside a man with the same restless spark as Matt. The resemblance was undeniable. Richard felt a cold line trace his spine. Lucy appeared behind him. "That was my father," she said softly. Richard turned. "Matt's dad?" She nodded. "He had ideas too, big ones, left for the city. Said he'd come back when he made something of himself. He never did." Her voice didn't crack, but her hands tightened on the ledger she carried. "We keep him here, in photos, because we don't know where else he is." Richard understood the unspoken. Julian's caution wasn't just stubbornness. It was grief wearing armor. That evening the shop felt different. The Mustang sat gleaming, ready. The Civic prototype hummed faintly in the corner, Matt's invention closer to life. Lucy balanced the books by lamplight, determined. Julian closed the doors, locking them with a ritual's finality. They ate outside again, stars appearing one by one. Richard listened as Matt explained torque curves with passionate gestures, as Lucy cut in with practical corrections, as Julian offered silence that said more than words. At one point, Lucy asked, "So when do you head back to your towers?" Richard looked at the sky, the stars sharper here than in the city. He hesitated. "When the car's ready, and maybe not a day sooner." Julian studied him, eyes narrowing, but said nothing. Later in his room, Richard lay awake again, but this time the ceiling fan wasn't restless. It was steady, like an engine tuned. He thought about towers of glass and steel, about contracts and deadlines. He thought about Matt's hands stained with grease and possibility. He thought about Lucy's quiet resilience, Julian's patient gravity. For the first time in years, he didn't feel hollow in the silence. He felt held. And yet, under it all, he sensed something looming: choices, risks, the inspector's shadow, Matt's invention, his own return to a life that suddenly felt smaller. Tomorrow would test more than engines. It would test whether he belonged to this road or the one he had paved in glass. The morning broke with a sharpness. Clouds swept clean, the kind of sky that felt like beginnings. Richard stood outside the inn with coffee in hand, staring at the Mustang waiting across the street. Its lines gleamed under the early sun, the engine humming faintly from yesterday's run. But today wasn't about tests. Today was about decisions. Inside the shop, Julian was tightening bolts at the breaker panel, his hands steady, even as the tremor flickered now and then. Lucy managed invoices at the counter, brow furrowed in her efficient way. Matt hovered over the Civic prototype, wires crisscrossing like veins, eyes burning with stubborn light. Richard crossed over, setting his mug on the bench. "Morning," he said. Julian grunted. "Morning." Lucy smiled briefly. "Breakfast's almost ready." Matt didn't look up. "Prototype's almost ready too." The Civic engine coughed, then caught. A strange hybrid hum filled the room, uneven at first, then steadying. Matt whooped, raising greasy hands like a victory flag. "It works." Julian stepped closer, cautious. "For now." Richard bent near, listening. The sound was raw but alive, the kind of rhythm that carried promise. He felt his chest tighten, the same way he had felt when he signed the deal for his first tower, when belief outweighed doubt. Matt turned, eyes fierce. "With the right backing, I can make this real. Kit's cheap enough for anyone, classics reborn, engines breathing new life." He looked straight at Richard. "I just need a chance." Julian's silence was heavy. Lucy looked from her cousin to her grandfather, then finally at Richard. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. Richard inhaled, slow. This was the moment. He saw the paths branching, the easy one back to glass towers, the harder one through grease and faith. He thought of the inspector's list, the weight of tradition, the risk of failure. He thought of Matt's fire, Lucy's resilience, Julian's steady hands. He turned to Julian first. "What if we do this together? Your wisdom, his invention, her management, and me, the backing to make it stand." Julian's brows furrowed. "You'd tie yourself to us? A dusty shop, a stubborn old man, a boy who hasn't yet failed enough?" Richard shook his head. "I'd tie myself to honesty, to building something that matters again." Lucy's breath caught. Matt's grin faltered into awe. Julian looked long at Richard, weighing. Finally he said, "Money is fast, work is slow. If you stay slow with us, maybe." Richard smiled. "Then slow it is." The shop went quiet. Even the fan seemed to pause. Then Matt burst out laughing, hugging his sketchbook like a trophy. "We're going to change everything." Lucy swatted him with the ledger, but her eyes shone. "Don't celebrate yet. Plans first." "Always plans." Julian only shook his head, though the corners of his mouth betrayed the smallest smile. That evening the Mustang stood ready, polished and tuned, its engine deeper than the day it arrived. Richard ran his palm across the hood, almost reluctant to take it back. He looked at Julian. "She's perfect," Richard said. Julian shrugged. "She's honest." Lucy handed Richard the keys. "So, you're leaving?" Richard turned the keys over in his palm. "Not leaving. Coming back. This isn't goodbye. It's the start." Matt leaned against the doorframe, grease smudges like badges. "Then next time you'll see the kit on a real car." Richard laughed. "Next time, maybe on this one." Julian's eyes flicked sharp at that, but he said nothing, only nodded. Richard climbed in, started the Mustang. The roar filled the street, heads turning. But this time, it didn't sound like a machine chained to the past. It sounded like something reborn. He drove away slowly, not rushing. The road stretched ahead, dust rising behind. For the first time in years, Richard wasn't thinking of deadlines, of glass towers, of contracts. He was thinking of pulse, of rhythm, of family not his own that somehow welcomed him. 4 days ago, he had been stranded. Now, he was found. And so, what began as a simple breakdown on a hot Monterey road became the spark of a new purpose. Richard thought he was only fixing a car. Instead, he found wisdom in Julian's hands, vision in Matt's fire, and steadiness in Lucy's heart. Together, they built not just engines, but a future. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. More powerful and emotional stories are on the way, and we'd love for you to be part of our community.